The candlelight flickers against cold stone walls, and you are only 7. Silk too heavy for your tiny shoulders clings to your skin, perfumed to mask the scent of fear. Outside, trumpets blare as if the world is celebrating, but in your chest beats the terror of a bird trapped in a gilded cage. A man 4 times your age waits, his crown gleaming, his eyes scanning you not as a child, but as property. The air reeks of incense and wine, drowning out your innocence. You try to steady your hands, but the rings slide heavy onto your fingers, chains disguised as jewels. The crowd calls it destiny, the priests call it holy, but you know it is a funeral for your childhood. What is a wedding, after all, when the bride cannot yet spell her own name? The palace gardens were her kingdom, or so she believed. You can almost see her. Tiny slippers darting through the gravel paths, ribbons flying behind her hair, laughter echoing against marble fountains. She was 7, and her world still smelled of honey cakes, pressed flowers, and the parchment of storybooks read aloud by maids who adored her. The walls of the palace felt less like a prison then, more like a secret fortress built to keep monsters away. But monsters do not always live outside the gates. Sometimes they wear crowns. At that age, she thought marriage was a word meant for dolls, a game of veils and giggles. Yet already, whispers filled the corridors, letters sealed with wax, voices lowered when she entered. Deals were being struck in languages she could not yet read, her life parcelled out like land on a map. She was taught to bow, to curtsy, to smile sweetly at portraits of kings, whose gaze followed her across the hall. In her innocence, she mistook this grooming for praise. "You will make a fine bride," they told her, and she blushed, not knowing what the word meant. Childhood was slipping quietly, like sand through her small fingers. But innocence never survives long in a palace built on politics. By the time she could trace letters on parchment, contracts had already been signed in her name. She was a princess, yes, but also a pawn. At supper, she noticed how her elders studied her face the way farmers inspect livestock, murmuring about her fair complexion, her delicate frame. They were not admiring her, they were evaluating her worth. The smell of roasted meats and spiced wine filled the hall, but to her it all tasted like ash, for each meal was a reminder that her childhood was shrinking beneath the weight of royal ambition. One morning, she overheard words she could not forget. "She will be sent away soon." Sent away. At 7. Her dolls lay abandoned on the floor as she pressed her ear against the oak doors, her small heart pounding. The name of a king, decades older, was whispered with finality. She did not know his face, only his age. She tried to ask her nurse, but the woman only smiled sadly and kissed her hair. The games of hide and seek were replaced by rehearsals of posture, recitations of prayers, endless fittings where silks were draped across her tiny shoulders until she felt buried beneath fabric heavier than herself. And though she did not fully understand, she began to feel it, the slow erosion of her play, her freedom, her laughter. In its place came the sound of quills scratching treaties, the cold ring of coins exchanged, the heavy silence of inevitability. Childhood was no longer hers. It had been bartered, traded, and sealed in wax. The night before her departure was unlike any other. The palace, usually alive with chatter and clattering dishes, felt eerily hushed, as though even the walls pitied her. In her chamber, a fire crackled low, casting shadows that stretched like long, reaching fingers across the tapestries. She clutched her favorite doll. Its face faded from years of play, and for the first time, it did not comfort her. Outside, she could hear the distant toll of church bells, each strike a reminder of what was coming. 7 chimes for 7 years. That was all she had lived, yet they were asking her to become a wife, a queen, a vessel for heirs. A chest stood open at the foot of her bed, filled with silks, jewels, and ribbons she had never asked for. The scent of lavender and wax from the candles filled the room, mingling with the faint salt of her tears. Her nurse braided her hair slowly, as if trying to prolong the moment, whispering prayers between her trembling fingers. "You must be brave," she said, but her voice cracked. Brave? For what? The little girl did not know, only that tomorrow she would no longer be allowed to play in the gardens or run laughing through the corridors. Tomorrow she would walk beside a man 4 times her age, and the world would applaud while her childhood was buried beneath a veil. That night she closed her eyes, clutching the doll tighter, but the darkness offered no dreams, only the echo of bells and the weight of chains she could not yet see. The morning of her wedding began with the sound of drums, low and relentless, shaking her from uneasy sleep. Servants entered her chamber like shadows, their arms burdened with garments too grand for a body so small. The air reeked of perfume. Amber, rose, musk, poured over her skin until her childlike scent of milk and play was erased. Silk stockings clung to legs that still bore the bruises of playground tumbles, while a corset was pulled tight around her ribs, each tug stealing breath, from lungs too young to bear it. "Stand still," the maid whispered, though the girl trembled. Outside, the courtyard erupted with trumpets, the metallic wail cutting through the morning air like a blade. Crowds gathered, eager for spectacle, their cheers rising as if this were a festival, not the funeral of innocence. She was led down corridors lined with tapestries of queens past, solemn women with vacant eyes, their gazes following her like a silent warning. The veil lowered over her face blurred the world into mist, but she could still see the altar ahead, drowning in candlelight and incense smoke. And there he was, the king. His crown caught the light, but his face was lined with years, his eyes cold with expectation rather than warmth. As she approached, the scent of wine and age clung to him, suffocating her. A priest began to chant, his words echoing, holy syllables turned into shackles. Rings of gold, heavy as chains, slid onto her small fingers, slipping past knuckles too tiny to hold them. The congregation roared with approval, blind to the tremor in her hands. In that moment, beneath the weight of vows she could not understand, the little girl disappeared. A bride stood in her place. The ceremony dragged on like an endless night, every gesture scripted, every word rehearsed by mouths older than time. She stood upon a dais too tall for her small feet, the velvet carpet swallowing her slippers, while nobles bowed and clapped as though they had witnessed a miracle. Musicians filled the hall with flutes and violins, the notes sharp and triumphant, yet to her ears they screeched like cries of mourning. She dared a glance at the towering man beside her, the king, her husband, and saw not a protector but a figure carved from stone, his hand heavy on hers, his grip more command than comfort. The air was thick with incense, choking her throat as prayers thundered through vaulted ceilings, echoing like chains rattling in a dungeon. When the crown was lowered onto her head, it tipped forward from the weight, sliding across her brow until it nearly covered her eyes. The audience laughed softly at the sight, charmed by the innocence of the child bride. To them, it was endearing, almost sweet. But for her, the crown was no symbol of glory. It was an anchor, pressing her down into a role she did not choose. She wanted to cry, to scream, to run back to the gardens of her childhood, yet her lips were sealed by the gaze of 1,000 eyes. The priest's words thundered again. "What God has joined, let no man tear asunder." In that instant, she understood. There would be no escape, no undoing. She was bound, not only to a man, but to a destiny that had stolen her playthings, her laughter, her very breath. The hall erupted in applause, but inside her chest, silence fell. A silence that would last for years. When the cheers had faded and the last goblets of wine were drained, the true silence began. She was led down a narrow corridor lit only by torches, their flames licking the stone and hissing in the draughts. Her slippers made no sound against the carpet, but her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Behind her, the maids whispered blessings, their eyes lowered, pity written across their faces but never spoken aloud. At the door of the bedchamber, she paused, clutching the edge of her gown, as though it might shield her. The door creaked open. Inside, the chamber was heavy with the scent of musk, candle wax, and something darker, the sour tang of wine lingering on the air. The curtains around the bed hung like funeral drapes, thick velvet that swallowed the room, in shadow. The king was already there, his robe half loosened, his crown discarded onto a chest. He watched her approach with the same cold detachment one might reserve for livestock, not a bride. The little girl's hands trembled as her veil was lifted, her face revealed to a man old enough to be her grandfather. She wanted to cry out, to call for her nurse, her mother, anyone. But the chamber was sealed, guarded by silence and duty. The candles sputtered as if in protest, their smoke curling upward like prayers denied. She stood motionless, her body small against the vastness of the bed. In that moment, she realized marriage was not a promise of safety or companionship. It was a sentence. Her childhood had not merely ended, it had been executed. Outside, the palace slept under a silver moon. But in this room, a child was being buried alive beneath silks and shadows. The morning after her wedding, the palace no longer felt familiar. The same corridors she once ran through freely now stretched like endless hallways in a prison, lined with watchful eyes. Servants bowed as she passed, but their reverence felt suffocating, reducing her not to a child nor even a girl, but to a figure of duty. Every step she took was trailed by whispers. The Queen, as though the word itself erased her name. Her chambers overflowed with luxuries meant to dazzle. Silk sheets embroidered with gold, jewels stacked in ornate boxes, perfumes sharp enough to burn the nose. But to her, they were bars gilded to hide their cruelty. The rituals began at dawn. She was awakened by maids, stripped, bathed, perfumed, dressed in layers upon layers of fabric until her small body sagged under their weight. Breakfast was served on silver trays, though she barely ate, each bite tasteless beneath the pressure of expectation. At court, she sat beside her husband, his hand heavy upon hers, his voice the only one that mattered. She was expected to smile when he smiled, nod when he nodded, bow her head when he spoke. Her silence became her role, her obedience the only language allowed. And yet, beneath the weight of jewels and etiquette, the child within her still lingered. She longed for the gardens, for the giggles of playmates, for the smell of cakes cooling in the kitchens. But those scents were replaced by incense and wine, her laughter replaced by prayers and commands. She looked into the mirrors framed in gold and barely recognized the face that stared back. She was dressed as a queen, paraded as a queen, spoken of as a queen. But within, she was only a frightened child, imprisoned by titles too heavy for her fragile shoulders. The nights were the cruelest. By day, she could hide behind ceremony and ritual, but when the doors closed and the corridors fell silent, there was no escape from what was demanded of her. The vast bed, carved from dark oak and draped in velvet, felt less like a place of rest and more like an altar of sacrifice. She was expected to give what she did not understand, to endure what her body was not ready for. Each time, the sheets smelled of sweat and wine, the heavy air pressing down until she could barely breathe. Her cries, muffled into the pillows, went unanswered. The palace walls were thick, built to keep secrets buried. The court celebrated her role as queen, but in private she was reduced to one function: to carry heirs. Physicians, priests, and midwives hovered around her body like vultures, whispering about fertility and duty as if she were a vessel rather than a living soul. When her small frame faltered under the strain, remedies of bitter herbs and hot compresses were forced upon her. Each month that passed without news of conception brought a sharper edge to her husband's gaze, a heavier silence in the dining hall. She was a child asked to become a mother, punished by disappointment when her body refused to obey. Even her emotions were not her own. Smiles were rehearsed, tears forbidden, laughter extinct. She learned quickly that survival meant silence. That rebellion, no matter how small, would be met with punishment cloaked in piety. Her identity, once fragile but hers alone, was being scrubbed clean, replaced by a hollow mask of queenship. In the mirror, she no longer saw the wide-eyed girl who once chased butterflies in the garden. Instead, she saw a figure draped in pearls, lips closed, eyes dimmed, a child's soul trapped within a woman's role. And the terrifying part was not that she was becoming someone else. It was that the girl she once was seemed to be vanishing entirely. With time, she began to understand that screaming would not open the doors of her prison, but silence might soften the chains. She learned to lower her eyes when the king's anger burned, to bow when courtiers tested her patience, to fold her hands when whispers turned sharp. But beneath that quiet mask, a slow fire began to smolder. The palace wanted her broken, obedient, emptied of will. Yet even as they pressed her into the role of a vessel, she clung to the small fragments of self that had not yet been stolen. She memorized the cracks in the marble columns, the pattern of tapestries on the walls, the sound of distant bells, anchors to remind her she was still alive, still aware. At night, when the air was heavy with incense and duty, she counted the stars through the window instead of the minutes of suffering. In her silence, she began to craft an invisible armor, layering patience over pain, composure over fear. Courtiers mistook her stillness for submission, but in truth, it was strategy, her only form of rebellion. Each time she smiled on command, each time she sat through rituals that carved away at her spirit, she told herself, "I am surviving." Small acts became her resistance. She would pause a heartbeat longer than allowed before answering, forcing those around her to feel her presence. She would choose to wear the pearls slightly out of place, a quiet reminder that she had not surrendered entirely. No one noticed, or perhaps no one cared, but these tiny choices were her way of whispering to herself, "You are still here." And in this private defiance, she began to change. The child who once trembled at every raised voice was being replaced by something harder, colder. She was learning how to wield silence as a weapon, how to turn endurance into power. Though still trapped within gilded walls, she was no longer the same girl who had first entered them. The palace believed it was erasing her. In truth, it was forging her. The palace, once a cage of whispers, soon became an arena where her body was no longer her own. Every gaze that followed her through the corridors carried a question, an accusation, or a silent demand. Was she strong enough to bear an heir? Her meals were watched, her steps measured, her silences interpreted like omens. She was no longer a woman to them, but a vessel, her worth tied not to her spirit, but to the possibility of new life she might bring into the dynasty. At feasts, courtiers clinked their goblets and exchanged sly glances when she refused wine. Midwives hovered near her chambers, as if her womb was a matter of state security. Even the king, once fiery in his passions, now spoke to her with calculation, measuring her body the way a general measures the strength of an army. When she smiled, they saw not her lips, but the promise of heirs. When she fell silent, they called it weakness. If she paled under candlelight, rumors spread like wildfire across the kingdom, that the queen was failing, that the dynasty was cursed, that her blood was too frail to carry the future. Her identity had been stripped layer by layer, until nothing remained but a question mark hanging over her body. She endured the humiliation of endless examinations, the weight of eyes that judged her belly before her words. Every time she was told to rest, every time she was denied the right to walk freely, she realized that her very existence had become a battlefield. Her chamber was not a sanctuary, but a throne room where her silence, her health, her every breath was transformed into royal decree. Yet even here, where her body had been reduced to politics, she clung to the thought that survival itself was power. She whispered to herself in the stillness of night, "If I cannot choose my fate, I will at least choose how to endure it. As the months passed, the court began to breathe down her neck with a hunger more violent than swords. Every servant carried whispers like daggers. Every noblewoman measured her with cold, merciless eyes. In the markets outside the palace walls, her name was traded like coin. Peasants spoke of her strength or her weakness with the same tone they used to discuss crops or weather. She was no longer flesh and blood. She had become a rumor, a prophecy, a fragile myth trembling beneath the weight of an empire. The king's advisors grew restless. Some dared to hint that the marriage was cursed, that the queen's bloodline was not strong enough for a dynasty. Others pressed for new unions, whispering that another woman might succeed where she had failed. At night, she could hear muffled voices beyond her chamber doors, debates disguised as concern, but dripping with greed for power. The palace itself seemed to conspire against her. Corridors echoed her footsteps back at her like mocking laughter, and every candlelit shadow carried the suspicion of betrayal. Her body betrayed her too. Sudden faintness, a trembling hand, a pallor too noticeable, all became evidence for those who sought her downfall. A single cough could become a prophecy of infertility. A single stumble was recast as the curse of a barren queen. They scrutinized her like parchment, searching for cracks in her flesh where the kingdom's future might already be collapsing. Alone at night, she pressed her hands against her stomach, as if trying to protect something not yet there, something that might save her from being erased. Tears fell silently, but she wiped them quickly, refusing to let even her own reflection see her weakness. To cry was to surrender, and she had long learned that surrender was death in slow motion. Still, the rumors grew, spreading like rot through the dynasty's roots. Every silence became a scandal, every breath a verdict. She was no longer a queen. They had made her into a womb-shaped crown, fragile, hollow, and endlessly watched. And she understood now. If she faltered, her body would not be her grave. It would be the downfall of a kingdom. By the time the 4th year dawned, her body had ceased to belong to her at all. Midwives checked her pulse without permission. Scribes recorded her monthly cycle as though cataloguing a relic, and courtiers demanded updates on her womb before they dared inquire about the weather. She was not spoken to, but spoken about. Her existence reduced to speculation, exchanged in whispers behind embroidered fans. Even her meals were dissected. Had she eaten enough to sustain a child? Too much to suggest desperation? Every bite was evidence, every glance a trial. Ceremonies grew crueler. She was paraded through halls heavy with incense, forced to touch holy relics while priests chanted prayers meant less for blessing than for spectacle. When she knelt, heads turned not in reverence but in analysis, measuring the angle of her shoulders, the tension in her jaw, the absence of swelling at her waist. The palace had become an operating theatre, and she, its unwilling specimen, dissected daily under the gaze of those who pretended loyalty while sharpening knives of judgment. Her loneliness hardened into silence. Once, she had spoken of dreams, of fears, of the life she wished to live beyond her gilded cage. Now, words only betrayed her. A careless sigh could be twisted into despair, a private laugh into madness. So she swallowed her voice, locking it behind clenched teeth until even she could no longer recall the sound of her own laughter. The king, once a distant protector, had turned into her harshest judge. His gaze lingered on her stomach longer than on her eyes. His touch carried calculation rather than comfort. In his silence, she felt the weight of exile creeping closer, a shadow that promised she could be replaced like a cracked chalice. To him, she was no longer wife or queen, merely a vessel that had failed to deliver its divine cargo. That night, staring into the mirror by candlelight, she no longer recognized herself. The woman reflected back was pale, hollow-eyed, crowned, but not alive, a ghost in royal silks. And in that moment, she realized the cruelest truth. Her body was not her own, her soul not her own. She had been consumed entirely by a kingdom that demanded her blood, but offered nothing in return. History rarely remembers her as a woman. To the scribes, she was a duty unfulfilled. To the priests, a failed vessel. To the court, a silence that grew too heavy to endure. Yet in truth, she was something far greater, a human soul broken on the altar of power. Her story ended not with triumph, but with erasure. Cast aside quietly, stripped of titles and the fragile illusions of love, she slipped from the palace walls like a shadow at dusk, leaving behind only whispers of her suffering. The king remarried, the kingdom moved on, and the chronicles praised the next queen who finally bore a son, as though the years of torment had been nothing more than a prelude to another's success. But the echo of her silence lingered, haunting those halls long after her body was gone. In her destruction lies the darkest revelation. Queens were not women, but instruments, their value measured only in flesh and airs. They could be crowned in gold, worshipped in song, paraded in silks, but if their wombs remained empty, all of it turned to ash. She became a ghost long before death claimed her, a living monument to how power devours its own, how even royalty cannot escape the cruelty of expectation. Today, the dust of her palace has long settled, yet her story whispers still. Not through marble statues or grand epics, but through the hollow silences of history, the parts that were deliberately left unsaid. She reminds us of a truth that kingdoms feared to record, that behind every crown lies a body, fragile and finite, and behind every dynasty lies a woman who was asked to give everything and was given nothing in return. And so she stands, nameless, to many, faceless to most, but eternal in her tragedy. The queen who lived not as herself, but as a womb for a kingdom, and died as nothing more than silence dressed in silk.